Nathan Whitmore didn't even look at her when he said it. He was standing at the foot of his father's bed, arms crossed, jaw set, the way men set their jaws when they've already made up their minds and don't want anyone to talk them out of it. Eliza had just stepped through the door, still carrying her suitcase, still brushing snow off her coat, when he turned and said, "You can put that down and turn right back around. We don't need a housekeeper. We need a doctor." She hadn't even taken off her gloves. "I was told your father needs care," Eliza said. "My father needs someone qualified." Nathan looked at her the way men looked at things they'd already decided were useless. "How old are you?" she told him. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "And what exactly are you trained in?" Eliza didn't answer right away. She set her suitcase down on the floor next to the door, unbuttoned her coat, and hung it on the hook by the wall as if he hadn't spoken at all. Then she said, "Let me see him." "I just said—" "I heard what you said." She looked at him then, not with anger, not with the pleading expression he probably expected, just steady. "Let me see him. If you have ever been told you were not enough before anyone even watched you try, if you have ever walked through a door and felt a room decide against you before you opened your mouth, then you already understand what Eliza Hartwell was carrying into Blackthorn Ridge that night. And if that moment speaks to something in your own life, stay with this story. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what happens next. Hit the like button if you've ever had to prove yourself to someone who wasn't willing to watch. And drop a comment with your city and country, because I want to know how far this story travels. The road to Blackthorn Ridge had taken 3 days. Eliza had known it would be long before she boarded the first coach. The advertisement had said remote, and she had taken that word seriously. But she hadn't anticipated the last stretch, the way the road narrowed until it stopped being a road at all and became a suggestion, a set of wheel ruts frozen solid under 2 feet of snow, the horses laboring, the driver swearing under his breath and not apologizing for it. She'd sat with her suitcase on her knees and her husband's medical journal pressed between her side and the wall of the coach, and she had not complained. She had learned not to. Frederick had been gone 14 months. 14 months was long enough to understand that grief did not empty you the way people warned you it would. It filled you with something else instead, a kind of hard, quiet practicality that looked a lot like coldness from the outside, but was really just survival wearing a plain face. She had sold the house. She had paid the debts. She had answered the advertisement because it was the most honest offer she'd received. A frontier ranch, a widower who needed managing, and room and board plus a wage that would let her put something away for the first time in 2 years. She had not expected this. The ranch house was dark when the driver let her down at the gate. Only one window showed light, and that light was thin and yellow and sickly looking, like a lamp turned too low by someone who'd forgotten to tend it. The wind came off the ridge in a long, flat gust that hit her across the face before she got the gate open. She stood there for a moment with her hand on the latch and her suitcase at her feet, looking at the house, and something in her chest recognized the place, not the house itself. The feeling of it. The feeling of something that had been held together past the point where holding together made any sense. She picked up the suitcase and walked toward the light. The young man who opened the door was not who she'd expected either. The advertisement had mentioned Caleb Whitmore, owner of Blackthorn Ridge, 63 years old, recently unwell. It had not mentioned a son. Nathan Whitmore was somewhere in his late 30s, wearing a good coat over a city shirt, and he had the look of a man who had traveled a long way very quickly and was operating on too little sleep and too much certainty. He looked at Eliza the way people looked at things that arrived at inconvenient times. "You're the housekeeper," he said. "Yes." "You're late." She wasn't, actually. The roads had delayed the coach by a day and a half, which the driver had explained at some length when they stopped in Harrow Creek, and which anyone paying attention to the weather would have expected. But she looked at Nathan Whitmore's face and understood that pointing this out would not be productive. "How is your father?" she asked instead. Something shifted in his expression. It wasn't softness. She didn't think this man did softness. Not naturally, not easily. It was more like a door opening a crack and then immediately closing again. "Not well," he said. Then, "Come inside." The front room was cold. Not the cold of a room that hadn't been heated, there was a fire in the grate, but the cold of a room that hadn't been lived in. The furniture was covered in dust. There were dishes on the table that hadn't been washed, and a coat thrown over the back of a chair. and 2 mugs with something dried hard in the bottom of them. Eliza took all of this in the way she took in most things, quietly, without visibly reacting. Nathan was already moving toward the hallway. "He's through here." She followed him. Caleb Whitmore was in his bed, and the first thing Eliza noticed was how small he looked. This was a man, she could tell, who had not been small in a long time. His hands on the blanket were large-knuckled and scarred, the hands of someone who had worked hard ground for decades, and his shoulders still carried the breadth of a bigger body. But he had lost weight recently, and substantially, and his color was wrong. He was burning, she could see that from the doorway. The slight fever flush, the way his chest moved when he breathed, too shallow, too fast. She stepped into the room. Nathan said, "This is the woman from the advertisement, Father." Caleb opened his eyes. They were gray and clear, which surprised her. She'd expected the dullness of serious illness, the milky unfocus she'd seen in her husband near the end. These eyes were sharp, tired and in pain, but sharp. "You got here," Caleb said. His voice was rough from disuse. "I got here," Eliza said. He almost smiled. "Roads bad?" "Passable," she said. "I've seen worse." Nathan said, "She just arrived. I was explaining to her that the situation has changed since Father posted the advertisement. We may not—" "Stop talking about me like I'm not in the room," Caleb said. Not loudly. He didn't have the strength for loud, but the firmness in it was unmistakable. The voice of a man who had spent his life making himself understood without raising his volume. Nathan stopped. Eliza sat down on the edge of the chair beside the bed without being invited to. She looked at Caleb's face. "How long have you had the fever?" "Comes and goes, worse the last week." "Are you eating?" A pause. "Not much." "Drinking?" "Water, when Nathan brings it." She looked at his hands. "Are your joints hurting?" Caleb considered this. "The left shoulder and my back." "On the left or the right?" "Left." She nodded. She was quiet for a moment, just looking at him. Then she said, "Have you been coughing?" "Some." "Wet or dry?" "Wet. Mornings mostly." Nathan said from the doorway, "What does any of this matter? He needs a physician, not a—" "He needs food," Eliza said. She didn't raise her voice either. She just said it the way you said something that was true and didn't need dressing up. "More than anything else right now, he needs food he can keep down. His body has been fighting this fever without enough fuel to fight it on. That's part of why he isn't recovering." She looked at Nathan. "When did he last eat a full meal?" Nathan opened his mouth, closed it. 4 days ago, Caleb said. "Maybe 5. The silence that followed was not comfortable. Eliza let it sit. She'd learned that silences were often more honest than the words that rushed in to fill them. "The pantry," she said finally. "What's in it?" Nathan said, "Not much. We've been waiting for the roads to clear to bring more supplies from—" "I'd like to see it." "There's no point. You can't make a—" "I'd like to see it," Eliza said again. She stood up from the chair. She wasn't tall, and she wasn't imposing, and she knew exactly how she looked to Nathan Whitmore. A tired woman somewhere past her youth, with a worn coat and no credentials and no business being here. She knew it, and she didn't care about it, which was perhaps the only thing that distinguished her from someone who would have folded under that look. Nathan stepped aside. She went to the pantry. It was worse than she'd expected and better than she'd feared, which was roughly how most things in life worked out. There were dried beans at the bottom of a sack. Not much, maybe a pound. A cloth bag with some flour, hardened at the edges. 3 onions that were starting to go soft, but hadn't turned. A bundle of dried herbs she didn't recognize at first, then did. Wild thyme, dried badly but still fragrant when she crushed a leaf between her fingers. In the very back, behind a broken crate, she found something better. A bundle of bones wrapped in cloth. The remains of some earlier slaughter, dry and cold and still carrying enough to be useful. She stood in the pantry for a long moment. Nathan was behind her. She could feel his impatience the way you felt weather coming, the pressure of it, the contained irritability of a man who had already decided what was going to happen and found her presence an obstacle to it. "As I said," he told her, "there's nothing here." Eliza picked up the bundle of bones. She picked up the bag of beans. She tucked the onions under her arm and carried everything to the kitchen table. Nathan said, "What are you doing?" "Cooking," Eliza said. With that, she set the bundle of herbs on the table beside the rest of it. Then she turned and looked at him. Your father hasn't eaten in 5 days. He has a fever that's been running for weeks. The roads are frozen, and the doctor won't come until morning at the earliest. She pulled her coat off and hung it over the back of a chair. Unless you'd like to do something else with the night, I'd suggest you get out of my kitchen. Nathan Whitmore stared at her. Then slowly, he stepped back. She turned to the stove. The fire inside it was low but not dead. She built it up carefully, not wasting anything, moving with the particular economy of someone who had cooked through hard winters before and knew that heat was not something you squandered. While the stove heated, she filled the largest pot she could find with water and set the bones in it, cracked one of the larger ones against the edge of the pot to let the marrow out, something her mother had shown her, something she hadn't thought about in years until her hands did it without being asked. The kitchen was cold, and the windows were dark, and outside the wind was building into something serious, the kind of wind that meant the night was going to be harder than the day had been. She could hear it working at the corners of the house, finding the weak places, testing them. She peeled the onions. Her eyes watered. She let them. Nathan was sitting at the kitchen table. He hadn't left. She noticed this but said nothing. He wasn't helping, wasn't talking, was just sitting there with his elbows on the table and his hands clasped, and his jaw in that same set, stubborn line. Watching her. Waiting, she thought, for her to fail. She understood the impulse. She'd had it herself in darker moments, the almost involuntary hope that someone who'd made you feel small would prove not to know what they were doing either. It was human. It was ungenerous, but it was human, and she was not interested in pretending she didn't understand it. She put the onions in the pot. An hour later, the broth was starting to come together. Thin still, not there yet, but beginning to smell like something that could hold you. She added a small handful of the dried thyme and watched the surface of the liquid for a while, thinking. Nathan said, "How did you learn to do this?" She didn't answer immediately. "My husband was a physician," she said finally. "Not a wealthy one. We didn't have much, most of our marriage, but he believed that what you put in a body when it was fighting for itself mattered more than most people understood." She kept her eyes on the pot. "He died of the influenza, 14 months ago." Silence. "I'm sorry," Nathan said. The first time he'd said anything that sounded like he meant it. "He taught me what he knew," she said, "because he believed someone should have it, even if I was the only one." Nathan was quiet for a while after that. Then he said, "He couldn't save himself." "No." "But you think you can save my father?" Eliza looked at him then. "I think your father is not as far gone as you believe," she said. "I think his body is exhausted and starving, and that exhaustion looks like dying to people who haven't seen the difference. I've seen the difference." She looked back at the pot. "That doesn't mean I'm certain. I'm not certain of anything, but I'd like the chance to try." Nathan looked at his hands. He didn't say anything else for a while. Eliza strained the broth through a piece of cloth she'd found in the drawer, holding the cloth over a bowl and watching the dark liquid pass through it, clear and rich and smelling of something that actually felt like nourishment. She added a pinch of salt, precious but necessary. She tasted it. It needed more time, but it would do. She carried the bowl to Caleb's room. He was awake, which she took as a good sign. He watched her come in with those clear gray eyes and said nothing while she set the bowl on the table beside him and helped him sit up. More difficult than it should have been, his arms weak, his breath coming in short, unsteady pulls. She didn't make him feel the difficulty of it. She just steadied him and moved the pillow and handed him the bowl. "Drink it slow," she said. "I know how to drink soup," Caleb said. "I know you do. Drink it slow anyway." The first swallow made him cough. The second one didn't. He drank slowly, the way she'd asked, and she sat in the chair beside the bed and watched his face and counted his swallows and waited for the one that would tell her she was wrong about him. The one where his body decided it couldn't hold even this. It didn't come. He finished half the bowl and she took it from him before he could push himself to finish all of it. "That's enough for now," she said. "I could take more." "I know. That's why you're stopping." He looked at her. "You're not much for being argued with, are you?" "I'm fine with being argued with," Eliza said. "I'm just not much for being wrong." Something happened to his face then. Not quite a smile, something older than a smile, a recognition of some kind. He settled back against the pillow and closed his eyes, and within 10 minutes he was asleep. Not the restless half-sleep she'd seen in him before. Something deeper. Something that looked like his body trusting the night for the first time in a long while. She sat beside him and listened to his breathing. Nathan came to the doorway at some point. She heard him, didn't turn around. He stood there for a moment watching his father sleep, and then he went back down the hall. She heard him in the kitchen, heard him put wood on the fire without being asked. It was a small thing. It was not nothing. Outside, the wind had settled into a long, low, steady howl, the kind that didn't gust and didn't stop, just kept going like something with a purpose. The house moved around it, not dramatically, just the small adjustments of old wood and changing pressure, the kind of sounds a house made when it was still alive. Eliza kept watch. She was not warm. She was not comfortable. Her back ached from the days of travel and the hard chair, and her eyes wanted to close in the way eyes did when they'd been told they couldn't. And the bowl in her lap was cold, and the night was very long. But she had sat through long nights before. She had sat through the longest night of her life in a room not unlike this one, with a man she loved more than she had ever said, watching his breathing change. She had learned what it meant to sit with someone through the dark and not look away. She looked at Caleb Whitmore's sleeping face. She thought about Frederick. She thought about the medical journal in her suitcase, the handwriting in the margins where he'd added his own thoughts to someone else's words, the way he'd pressed small leaves and bits of bark between the pages when he found them useful, the way the book smelled of him still, or maybe she only imagined it did. She thought about the advertisement, the quiet job, the place to survive. She thought about how things never arrived the way you pictured them. 2 hours before dawn, Caleb stirred. She was ready with the second half of the broth, warmed again on the little lamp she'd brought from the kitchen. He drank it without protest this time, and when he was finished, he looked at her with those clear gray eyes and said, "What's your name again?" "Eliza," she said. "Eliza Hartwell." He nodded, settling back. "You're not going to leave, are you?" It wasn't quite a question. "Not until you don't need me," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That might be a while." "That's all right," Eliza said. "I'm not in a hurry." Outside, the wind was still going. The house was still holding. And in the kitchen, she could hear Nathan Whitmore moving quietly around, keeping the fire, doing the small, useful thing that people did when they didn't know how to say they'd been wrong. It wasn't forgiveness yet. It wasn't trust. It was just a man adding wood to a fire in the middle of the night, in a house where something had shifted without anyone being able to name exactly when it happened. But that was how most things began. Not with announcements, not with apologies, just with someone deciding, quietly, in the dark, to keep the fire going until morning. Morning came the way it often did after bad nights. Not with any particular grace, just a slow lightening of the windows and the wind dropping off enough that the silence felt almost loud by comparison. Eliza heard it before she saw it. The quality of the air changed. The house stopped its small adjustments. And Caleb Whitmore, who had been asleep for nearly 4 hours in the deepest, stillest sleep she'd seen from him yet, made a sound that wasn't pain and wasn't distress, just the sound of a body resettling itself, of lungs taking a fuller breath than they'd managed in days. She was still in the chair. Her back told her so immediately and without kindness. She straightened slowly, pressing one hand to the base of her spine the way she always did when she'd been in one position too long, and looked at Caleb's face. The fever flush was still there. She didn't expect miracles overnight, and she didn't believe in them. But the tight, strained look around his eyes had eased. His breathing was slower, less shallow. She reached over and pressed the back of her wrist against his forehead, an old habit, more reliable than it looked, and found him warm but not the burning, papery heat of the night before. She exhaled. Not relief exactly. It was too early for relief, but something adjacent to it. The specific feeling of a thing that might be going the right direction. She picked up the empty bowl from the table beside him and the lamp and went back to the kitchen. Nathan was asleep at the kitchen table. He'd fallen asleep sitting up, which looked exactly as uncomfortable as it was. His head resting on his folded arms, his coat still on, one hand curled around a mug that had long gone cold. He hadn't meant to fall asleep. She could tell by the way the chair was pulled out at an angle, like he'd meant to get up and hadn't made it. There was a small pile of wood near the stove, neatly stacked, that he must have brought in from outside before he sat down. She looked at him for a moment. He looked younger asleep, less like a man who had walked into a room with all his conclusions already drawn. She didn't wake him. She set the bowl quietly in the basin and put the lamp back on the shelf and started the fire up again, working slowly, not wanting the sound of it to disturb him yet. There was something she needed to think through before the day got started, before he woke up, and the arguments resumed and the careful, fragile things she'd managed through the night got trampled under the weight of his certainty. The broth had done what she'd hoped. Caleb had kept it down, and it had given his body something to work with, some fuel for the fever to burn that wasn't the fever burning through the last of him. But one night of broth was not recovery. It was the first step toward a place where recovery might be possible, which was different, and she needed Nathan to understand that difference before he took it as proof of whatever he'd already decided. She filled the pot again and started another round with what was left of the bones. Less marrow now, but still something. She added the last of the beans soaked from the night before when she'd thought to put them in water while she was still working on the broth. They'd need time. She had time. The roads were still frozen, and the morning was white and empty outside the window. And whatever Nathan had planned about sending for a doctor would have to wait on the weather like everything else out here. The beans went in. She put the lid on the pot. She sat down across from Nathan's sleeping form at the table and pulled the medical journal from the pocket of her apron. She'd moved it there from the suitcase at some point in the night, some instinct for keeping it close, and opened it to the section Frederick had marked with a strip of cloth. His handwriting was small and precise, the handwriting of a man who was careful with space. She'd memorized most of what was in here, but reading it still felt like hearing his voice, and sometimes she needed that. Not often, but sometimes. Fever of prolonged duration. Primary danger is not the fever itself, but the depletion it causes. The body requires constant input to mount any sustained defense. Starvation weakens the immune response as surely as the illness itself. Feed the patient. Feed the patient. This is not complicated, but it is constantly overlooked. She'd laughed when she first read that. The repetition of it. Feed the patient. Feed the patient. As if he was writing it down to argue with someone who wasn't there yet. She closed the journal. Nathan shifted in his chair. One of his arms slid off the table and he jerked awake, catching himself, blinking at the kitchen with the brief disorientation of someone who'd forgotten where they were. Then he saw Eliza across the table and remembered, and the open look on his face, the unguarded look of a person just back from sleep, closed again. "What time is it?" he said. Not a question exactly. More like he was checking to see if language still worked. "Past 7, she said. "The light's been up for about an hour." He straightened in the chair, rolling his shoulders back, wincing. "How is he?" "Better than he was," she said. "Not well." "Better." Nathan rubbed his face with both hands. He needed to shave. She noticed it the way you notice things that didn't matter, but were there. "You stayed up all night," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I was going to—" "You needed the sleep," Eliza said. "You've been traveling, and there wasn't anything for two people to do. One person watching is the same as two." He didn't thank her. She hadn't expected him to, but he didn't argue either, which was something. He stood up, moved to the stove, and looked at the pot. "What's this?" "Bean soup. It'll take a few more hours." "You're still at it." "I said I would be." He turned and looked at her. There was something different in his face this morning. She couldn't name it exactly. The sharp dismissiveness of the night before had been replaced by something more complicated. Not respect. Not yet. More like the expression of a man who had assumed a card game was already over and come back to the table to find his opponent still playing. "My plan," he said carefully, "was to ride for Dr. Hennessy in Harrow Creek as soon as the road was passable." "That's a reasonable plan," Eliza said. He seemed slightly surprised she agreed. "It is. Dr. Hennessy should see him. I'm not arguing against that. I'm saying don't wait to feed him while you're waiting for the road." She pulled the journal from her apron pocket and set it on the table, not opening it, just putting it there. "Your father's body is doing exactly what a body does when it's been given something to fight with. That needs to keep going." The broth last night was the beginning, not the solution. Nathan looked at the journal. "What is that?" "My husband's notes." He looked at her. "The physician." "Yes." "May I—" He reached for it, then stopped. "Can I look at it?" She slid it across the table to him. He opened it with more care than she expected, turning the pages slowly, reading. She watched his face. He was a careful reader. His eyes moved deliberately, line by line, not skimming. After a few minutes, he stopped on one of the marked pages, the one with the passage she'd been reading, and she watched him read it twice. He set the journal down. He didn't push it back to her, which she took as a kind of acknowledgement. He believed in this, Nathan said. Your husband. He did. And you've seen it work. Eliza looked at her hands on the table. She thought about Frederick. She thought about the patients she'd helped him with over the years, the ones who'd come back from the edge because someone had thought to keep feeding them, and the ones who hadn't come back because no one had understood in time. I've seen it fail too, she said. I'm not making promises I can't keep. I'm telling you what I've seen and what I know is that your father is not as far along as you think he is, but he will be if we don't keep at this. Nathan was quiet. Then he said, he didn't want to tell me how bad it was when I arrived. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the table, at the journal. I'd been writing to him for 3 months. He kept saying he was improving. I believed him because... He stopped. Because I wanted to believe him. Eliza didn't say anything. Some things didn't need a response. They just needed to be said and then let sit. When I got here 2 weeks ago, Nathan continued, he'd been in bed for 5 days. He hadn't told me. In the letters he was talking about the spring planting. He pressed his lips together. The spring planting. She understood. She understood the particular ache of it, the realization that someone you loved had been carrying something alone because they didn't want to worry you, or didn't want to need you, or both. It was a specific kind of grief. Not loss yet, but the shape of potential loss, the shadow it threw. He's stubborn, she said. Yes. A pause. Where do you get that? From the way he talked last night, the way he corrected you. She almost smiled. Stubborn men don't thank people for noticing. Something loosened in Nathan's face, not quite a smile back, but close. No, he said. They don't. The bean soup came together over the following hours with the slow, unglamorous patience of food that was working hard and knew it. Eliza checked on Caleb twice before it was ready, once when she heard him cough, which turned out to be a single short cough rather than the long, exhausting fits she'd worried about, and once simply to see. Both times he was awake, and both times he asked her questions. The first time he asked whether Nathan had gone for the doctor yet. The second time he asked what she was cooking. Beans, she told him. With what? Bone stock. Onion. He made a face. Not an unhappy face. The face of someone who had been missing food badly enough that even beans and bone stock sounded like something worth making a face about. No salt pork? When the road's clear, she said. He was quiet for a moment. You know what you're doing, he said. Not a question this time. Most of the time, she said. What about the rest of the time? I figure it out, Eliza said. Same as everyone. He made a sound that might have been a short laugh, which was more than she'd heard from him yet, and she took that as a better sign than any temperature check. Nathan was outside when she came back to the kitchen. She could see him through the window. He'd gone to look at the road, she thought, or maybe just needed air. He was standing at the fence line looking down the slope, his hands in his coat pockets, the wind moving his hair. She watched him for a moment without meaning to. He was not a simple man. She'd known that the night before, even through the difficulty of him. People who were simple didn't stand at fence lines with that particular set to their shoulders. The weight of something more than weather. He came back inside with the cold air coming off him. Road's still frozen solid, he said. There's another front coming in from the north. We might have 2 more days, maybe 3. Eliza nodded. She'd expected something like this. Then we make do. I was thinking, Nathan said, and then stopped, which was not a thing she'd seen him do yet. Stop himself in the middle of a thought to make sure it was ready to be said. There's a smokehouse out back. I don't know what's in it. Father hasn't been well enough to... I didn't think to look. She looked at him. I thought perhaps, he said, you might want to. She wiped her hands on her apron. Show me. The smokehouse was behind the barn, small and cold, the latch frozen stiff enough that Nathan had to work it with both hands. When the door swung open, the smell hit them both. Cold smoke and cured meat, and something she couldn't immediately name that turned out to be a crock of something sealed with wax near the back. Nathan held the door and she went in. There were 2 haunches of smoked venison hanging from the rafters. They were old. The outside had the dull, dry look of meat that had been up a while, but when she pressed her thumb against one, the interior held, dense and preserved, the way properly smoked meat was supposed to. She pressed her nose close. Good. Nothing spoiled. There was a good deal of life left in these if she used them carefully. "Did you know these were here?" she asked. "I didn't look," Nathan said. He was standing in the doorway, looking at the haunches with an expression she couldn't immediately read. "Father put these up in October. He told me in a letter. I'd forgotten." She turned to the crock with the wax seal. She worked the wax loose with her thumbnail and lifted the cloth beneath and found what she'd half hoped for. Rendered fat, set solid, the kind of thing that turned a bear broth into something that could hold a person together. She put the lid back. "We can work with this," she said. "Yes," Nathan said. "I see that." Something in his voice made her look at him again. He was still looking at the hanging haunches, and she realized, with the particular perception she'd developed over years of watching sick people and their families, that he wasn't seeing the meat. He was seeing October. He was seeing his father, well enough to put these up, doing the careful seasonal work of a man who expected to live through winter and beyond. She didn't say anything about it. She picked up the crock and tucked it under one arm and reached up for the smaller of the 2 haunches. "I'll take the crock," Nathan said. She handed it over. They walked back to the house without talking, through the thin white morning, and she was aware of how different this felt from the night before. The 2 of them moving together toward the same door, carrying things that would be used together. The opposition between them, not gone exactly, but shifted. Not yet cooperation, something more tentative than that. The beginning of people finding out if they could be in the same room without it costing too much. The venison changed everything about the soup. She cut it carefully, in small pieces, not wanting to overwhelm a stomach that hadn't handled solids in days, and added it to the beans with the rendered fat, and let the whole thing come up to a simmer and then back down, slow and patient, the way you cooked for people who needed to be coaxed back. Nathan watched from the doorway. He'd stopped pretending he wasn't watching. "You did this for your husband," he said, not accusatory, just working something out. "Sometimes," she said, "when he was sick. He was sick a lot the last 2 years. His lungs were never strong." She kept her eyes on the pot. "I couldn't save him. I want to be clear about that. What I know isn't—" She paused. "What I know is useful. It isn't magic. Frederick would have been the first to tell you that." "But you stayed with him, through all of it." "Of course I did. Even when it wasn't—" Nathan seemed to be choosing words with unusual care, for him. "Even when you knew he wasn't going to—" "Yes," Eliza said. "Even then." She picked up the spoon and turned the soup. "That's not something you decide. That's just what you do." Nathan was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he'd left, but when she glanced back, he was still there, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed and his eyes on something she couldn't see. "I sent money," he said finally. She waited. "When he first started being unwell, a year and a half ago, when he mentioned his health in a letter, I sent money for a doctor and told him to hire someone to help with the heavy work. He wrote back and said he was fine, and he'd hired a boy from town for the spring, and He stopped. "I accepted that. I was in the middle of a business arrangement in Denver. I told myself he was managing." Eliza didn't say anything. "I should have come sooner," Nathan said. The words landed in the kitchen with a weight she recognized. The weight of a thing that was true and couldn't be undone, which was the heaviest kind of true there was. She had sat with that weight herself. She knew better than to try to lift it for him. "You're here now," she said. "That's not—" "I know it's not enough," she said. "I'm not saying it is. I'm saying it's what there is to work with." She looked at him. "Same as what's in the pantry." He held her gaze for a moment. Then slowly, he nodded. She turned back to the soup. By noon, Caleb was sitting up on his own, which was the first time he'd managed it without help. Eliza found him that way when she brought the midday soup. Real soup now, with the venison and beans together, thickened slightly with a small amount of the flour, the smell of it filling the whole hallway before she even got to the door. Caleb looked at the bowl when she set it down. "That's real food," he said. "It is." He ate. Slowly, carefully, the way she'd asked him to, but he ate all of it this time, every drop. When he was done, he sat with the empty bowl in his hands and looked at her, and she looked back, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "How bad was it?" he asked. "Honestly? I wouldn't ask if I didn't want it honest." She thought about how to say it. "Your body was running out of reserves," she said. "The fever had been going long enough, and without enough food that you were starting to consume yourself. Another few days the way things were going." She stopped. "You would have gotten weaker faster than you got better." He absorbed this. But that's not where you are now," she said. "You kept down everything from last night. You kept down today's. Your color is better. You're sitting up without help." She met his eyes. "You're not out of this yet, but you're closer to in it than out of it, and that's different from yesterday." Caleb was quiet. He turned the empty bowl over in his hands. His hands, she noticed, were less trembling than they'd been. Still not steady, but less. "Nathan," he said, "how is he?" "He brought in the wood last night," she said. "This morning he found the smokehouse. He's been in the kitchen most of the day." Something moved across Caleb's face that she couldn't name exactly. Pride and something more complicated than pride. "He's not easy," he said. "No," she agreed. "He wasn't raised to be easy. I didn't—" He stopped. "I raised him to be capable. I think I forgot to also raise him to be—" He seemed to be looking for the word. "Patient?" she offered. Caleb looked at her. "I was going to say kind," he said, "but patient would do." She thought about Nathan at the table that morning, the careful way he'd turned the pages of Frederick's journal, the way he'd stood in the smokehouse looking at the meat his father had put up in October. "He's capable of it," she said. "He just hasn't had much practice." Caleb set the bowl on the table. "You've known him less than a day." "I know," Eliza said, "and you can already see that." "Some things don't take long to see," she said, "if you're looking for them." He was quiet again. He had these periods of quiet that weren't uncomfortable. A man who had spent decades on his own land, in his own company, and had not lost the ability to simply be still. She appreciated it. It gave her room to think without having to perform anything. "You're not what I expected," Caleb said finally. "What did you expect?" The advertisement said housekeeper. He looked at her. "I expected someone who would keep the house." "I can keep the house," Eliza said. "I can also do this." "I see that." She stood up, taking the bowl. "Get some more rest. I'll bring supper before dark." She moved toward the door. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said. She turned. "Thank you," Caleb said. He said it plainly, the way he'd said everything, without decoration, without hedging, just the thing itself. It was the most valuable kind of thank you, she had always thought, the kind that didn't ask for anything back. "You're welcome," she said, and meant it the same way. The afternoon passed in the particular quiet of days that had decided to be workable. She cleaned the kitchen, properly, not cursorily, found the broom and the rags and put things where they belonged, the way she always had to understand a house before she could really be in it. She found a half-full crock of vinegar behind a crate that she used to scrub the table. She found a drawer with sewing materials and a button she recognized as the kind that went on work coats. Small findings, useful things. Nathan was outside for most of the afternoon, doing whatever needed doing on a ranch when the owner was ill and the snow was heavy and the world had contracted to the width of the fence line. She could hear him occasionally, the sound of the axe splitting wood, the sound of the barn door. She didn't watch for him. She had her own work. But when he came in at dusk, stamping snow off his boots in the entry, she had supper waiting. Not just for Caleb this time. A full pot on the table, bowls for 3. Nathan stopped when he saw it. She didn't explain. She ladled out a bowl and set it across from her own place and sat down. After a moment he sat too. He picked up the spoon. He ate. They didn't talk for a while. The fire in the stove made its small sounds. The house was warmer than it had been the night before. Nathan had brought in enough wood. Outside the temperature was dropping again. She could feel it in the way the windows sat in their frames, but inside it was holding. "I was better today," Nathan said, halfway through the bowl. "Yes. I looked in on him this afternoon. He was asleep, but—" Nathan turned the spoon over. "He looked like himself. More than he has since I got here." Eliza nodded. She ate her own soup and thought about what tomorrow would look like, and what the day after that would need, and how much of the venison they could spare before the roads cleared and the supplies could come through. The calculations of scarcity. She had always been good at those, which was not a thing she was proud of exactly, just a thing she was. "What do you need?" Nathan said. She looked at him. "Tomorrow," he said. "What do you need to keep this going?" She thought about it. "The venison needs to last another 4 or 5 days at minimum. I'll need to be careful with it. The beans will be gone day after tomorrow. If there's anything else stored anywhere, anything at all, I'd want to know about it. I'll look in the morning. And your father needs to keep moving toward solid food, but slowly, no rushing it." Nathan nodded. "What else?" She paused. It was an unusual question coming from him. What else? As if he was making a list, as if he intended to do something with it. "Rest," she said. "For both of you. You look like you haven't slept more than a few hours at a stretch in 2 weeks." He didn't argue. "There's a second bedroom," she said, "down the hall. Use it tonight. I'll be up with your father if he needs anything. You can't stay up again. I'll sleep in the chair when he settles. I've done it before." She picked up her bowl. "You can't help him if you fall apart." He looked at her steadily. "You could have said that yesterday. You could have said that when I told you to leave." "I could have," she agreed. "Why didn't you?" Eliza set down the bowl. She thought about it honestly, the way she tried to think about most things. Not the answer that sounded right, but the one that was. "Because it wasn't the right moment," she said, "and because some things are better shown than argued." Nathan sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "I was wrong. Yesterday." "I know," Eliza said. "I'd like to—" "You already have," she said. "The wood, the smokehouse, supper." She looked at him. "That's how it works. Not the saying, the doing." He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his bowl again and finished his soup. She did the same. The fire worked in the stove. Outside, the temperature kept dropping, and the sky was the particular dark of a sky with more snow behind it. And inside the house at Blackthorn Ridge, something had changed. Not fixed, not resolved, not anything so clean as that, but changed. The way things changed when the worst possible night was behind you in the morning, though not guaranteed, was at least something you were still facing together. Caleb slept well again that second night. And when Eliza woke in the chair near 3 in the morning, her back aching and her neck stiff and the lamp burning low beside her, she heard something she hadn't heard since she'd arrived. The house, settling into the cold with the ease of something that had decided it was going to stand. She didn't know yet what the coming days would bring. She wasn't foolish enough to think the hard part was over. But she knew what she had to work with now, and she knew she hadn't been wrong, and she knew that the man in the bed beside her was breathing slow and steady, and that somewhere down the hall, Nathan Whitmore was finally, actually asleep. It was enough. For tonight, it was enough. The road cleared on the 4th day. Not fully. There were still stretches where the ice sat thick and blue-white between the frozen wheel ruts, and the horses would have to be careful, but clear enough that Nathan could get through to Harrow Creek if he left early and didn't push the pace. Eliza told him to go at first light. He was already up when she came to the kitchen, his coat on and his boots laced, drinking the last of the coffee she'd made the night before and heating cold. "He ate this morning," she said. Nathan looked up. "I got up at 5 and made him porridge. He ate most of it and kept it down and asked me what day it was." She pulled her shawl tighter. "That's the clearest he's been since I arrived." Something moved across Nathan's face. Relief, but also something wary in it. The particular caution of a man who had let himself hope before and found it costly. "You're certain he's better?" "I'm certain he's better than he was," she said. "I'm not certain of more than that, which is why you should go." He nodded. He poured the rest of the cold coffee into the basin and put on his hat. At the door he paused, his hand on the frame, not quite turning around. "There's wood enough for 2 days stacked by the back wall. The horses are fed. If anything, go," she said. "I've managed 2 nights already." He went. She listened to the sound of the horse moving away from the barn, the creak of the gate, and then just the wind and the house settling, and then nothing much at all. She stood at the window for a moment and watched the gray-white morning. Then she turned and went to Caleb's room. He was sitting up against the headboard, which he'd done himself. 2 days ago, she'd had to help him with that. She didn't say anything about the difference. He'd notice her not saying anything, and that would be enough. "Nathan's gone for the doctor," she said. "I know. I heard the horse." He watched her move to the chair. "You don't have to sit in here all morning. I'm not going to fall over." "I know you're not," she said. She sat down anyway. He made a sound. Not quite irritation, not quite amusement, the sound a man made when he was too tired to fully argue. "You're stubborn," he said. "You're not the first to notice," Eliza said. He looked at her for a moment, then, "Tell me about yourself." "We've been in this room together for 4 days, and I don't know a thing about you except that your husband was a doctor and you can cook a bone into something useful." "Physician," she said. He'd want the distinction made. "All right, physician." He settled against the headboard. "Well?" She considered how much to give him and what. Not because she was private exactly, she wasn't sentimental about privacy, but because the shape of her own life, laid out for a stranger, always felt stranger to her than it had while she was living it. "I grew up in Ohio," she said. "My father farmed. Not well, but honestly. I married Frederick when I was 22. We moved around. He followed his practice wherever it took him, smaller towns mostly, places that needed doctors more than they could pay for them." She paused. "We never had children. That was—" She stopped. "That was something we carried." Caleb didn't offer consolation. She was grateful for that. "We had 14 years, she said. They were good years, most of them. Hard sometimes, but good." She looked at her hands. "When he died, I was 46 with no family left, no house, and a medical journal. And you answered my advertisement. Yours was the most honest one," she said. "Remote ranch, the work is real, the pay is modest. Most advertisements dress things up. Yours didn't." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "I wrote it myself," he said. 3 drafts. Every time I tried to make it sound better than it was, I crossed it out." She nodded. She could believe that. "I had a wife," he said then. The words came out in the particular way that old wounds spoke when they'd been quiet long enough to feel safe. "Nathan's mother, Margaret. She died when Nathan was 11. He looked at the window. It was the winter of 54. Fever, same as what I've had, but it moved faster in her, 3 days. He was quiet. "I didn't know how to raise a boy after that. I knew how to work land. I knew how to build things. I didn't know how to—" He stopped. "He grew up watching me work. I thought that was enough." Eliza thought about Nathan at the kitchen table, reading Frederick's journal with that careful, deliberate attention. She thought about him in the smokehouse, looking at the haunches of venison and seeing October. "He learned something from it," she said. "He learned how to be capable," Caleb said. "He learned how to be decisive. He learned how to walk into a room and know what needed doing." He paused. "He didn't learn how to wait." "No," she said. "That's my fault." "Maybe," Eliza said. "Or maybe it's just the shape he is, and the waiting is something he'll have to find on his own." Caleb looked at her. "You think he can?" She thought about the past 4 days. The wood. The smokehouse. The way he'd sat at the kitchen table with the journal, not reading fast, not skimming, giving it his full attention the way a man gave something his attention when he understood that he'd been wrong about it. "I think he's already starting," she said. Caleb closed his eyes. She could see the tiredness in him still, the deep tiredness of a body that had been fighting for a long time and was only beginning to believe it was allowed to stop. She let him rest. She had work to do anyway. The kitchen needed tending, the fire needed building up, and she'd been thinking since the day before about the flour. There was enough left for something more substantial than she'd been making, and Caleb's stomach had tolerated everything she'd given it these last 2 days. She wanted to try bread. Simple bread, nothing complicated, just the basic thing. Something that smelled like a house that was being lived in. It mattered, the smell of things. She'd noticed that about sick people. The smell of food cooking reached them before the food itself did, began working on them before they'd taken a single bite. Frederick had written about it in the margins of his journal. The anticipation of nourishment is itself nourishing. Do not underestimate what a good smell does to a body that has forgotten it deserves to eat. She made the bread. It took most of the morning, the slow, particular work of dough that needed time and warmth and patience. She put it close to the stove and covered it and let it rise and then let it rise again because the kitchen was cold and it needed the extra time. And when she finally put it in the oven, she stood at the window and watched the snow on the ridge and thought about spring. Not the spring at Blackthorn Ridge. She couldn't picture that yet, didn't know this land well enough to imagine it green. Just spring in the abstract, the idea of thaw, of things opening back up. She heard Caleb before she saw him. She heard the slow, deliberate creak of footsteps in the hallway. Uneven, careful, the footsteps of someone who knew they were unsteady and was not pretending otherwise. She turned from the window. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding onto the frame with one hand, dressed, or mostly dressed. He'd put on trousers and a shirt but no coat, his feet in worn socks, his hair uncombed. He looked like a man who had decided to do something and had done it before the part of his brain that could talk him out of it woke up. She opened her mouth. "Don't," he said. She closed it. He made it to the table. He lowered himself into the chair with the controlled, deliberate care of someone managing the distance between where they were and where they might fall. And when he was down, he let out a long breath through his nose and looked at her with an expression that was pure stubbornness dressed up as dignity. "I've been in that bed for 3 weeks," he said. "I'm sitting at my own table." Eliza looked at him. He was pale, and his hands on the table were not entirely steady, and the walk from the bedroom to the kitchen had cost him more than he was letting on. All of this was true. Also true, he was sitting at his own table, and the set of his jaw was the jaw of a man who was going to sit there whether she approved of it or not. She turned back to the stove. "The bread will be ready in about 20 minutes. She heard his exhale. Relief, she thought, that she wasn't going to make it a fight. "Smells good," he said. "It should. I haven't made any in a while." "You used to?" "Every Saturday," she said, "when we had a house with a proper oven." She checked the bread without taking it out, just lifted the edge of the cloth and looked at the color of the top. "Not yet. Close." "Frederick would make coffee and read to me while I made bread. He read aloud badly, went too fast and skipped words he thought were unimportant." She smiled without meaning to. "I never told him that. He enjoyed it too much." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "You miss him." "Every day," she said. "Less sharp than it was, but every day." "That's how it goes," he said. And the simple authority in it, the weight of someone who knew from experience, not theory, was the kindest thing he could have offered her. She put 2 cups of water on the stove to heat. Not coffee, they were out. But something warm was better than nothing, and she'd found a small amount of dried chamomile in the back of the herb drawer that would do. They sat in the kitchen while the bread finished, not talking much, just existing in the same space, which was its own kind of conversation after the intensity of the past days. When the bread came out, she cut it while it was still too hot, and the inside was a little gummy, and it didn't matter at all. She put a thick slice in front of Caleb and watched him eat it with the same attention she'd given the broth on the first night, watching for the moment his body decided it couldn't manage it, the small signs she'd learned to read. He ate all of it. He asked for another piece. She gave him half of one. "Half," he said. "Half," she confirmed. He ate the half. He sat back in his chair with the cup of chamomile water and looked around the kitchen as if seeing it from this angle, his own kitchen, from his own chair, was something that required a moment's taking in. She understood that. She'd had moments like that after Frederick died, when ordinary things in ordinary places suddenly had to be relearned from a slightly different position. "I want to be outside tomorrow," he said. "No." "I didn't ask." "I know," she said. "The answer is still no. 3 more days at minimum before you go outside. The cold will undo everything we've done." He looked at her. "You're going to be very difficult to have around, aren't you?" "Probably," Eliza said. "Do you want more bread?" His mouth twitched. "Yes," he said. She gave him another half slice. Dr. Hennessy arrived in the late afternoon, riding ahead of the weather with the particular urgency of a man who had learned not to let himself be caught between 2 fronts. He was younger than Eliza had expected, mid-40s, compact, with the brisk, observational energy of someone who spent a lot of time being the calmest person in a difficult room. He came in stamping snow and took his coat off and shook Eliza's hand before Nathan had even finished introducing them. And then he went straight to the room where Caleb had retreated for a rest after the kitchen visit. Eliza waited in the hallway. Nathan stood beside her and also waited, which she noticed because the Nathan who had arrived at Blackthorn Ridge 4 days ago would have gone into the room without asking and told the doctor what he thought while he was in there. The door was closed for 20 minutes. When Hennessy came out, he looked at Eliza first. "You've been managing him," he said. It wasn't a question. "Since I arrived," she said, 4 nights ago. Hennessy nodded slowly. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized. The careful, assessing look of a professional trying to place another professional and not quite finding the right category for them. "He told me what you've been feeding him," he said. "The broth, the bone stock, the progression to solid food." "My husband was a physician," she said. "He believed in feeding the patient," Hennessy said. He smiled, a quick, real smile. "Yes. I've believed the same thing for 20 years and spent 15 of those years arguing about it with colleagues who think a sick person should rest their digestion." He shook his head. "How long ago did the fever break?" "It came down significantly the second night. Yesterday morning it was close to normal. This morning I couldn't detect anything notable." "He still has some inflammation in the lungs," Hennessy said. "I don't want him outside in the cold for at least a week. He needs to keep eating, real food, not invalid diet, actual sustaining food. And he needs to sleep." He paused. "He told me you told him the same things." "I did." "Did he listen?" "He walked to the kitchen this morning without telling me," she said, "and sat at the table for an hour." Hennessy looked at her. Then he looked at Nathan. Then he made a sound that was either a cough or a suppressed laugh. "That sounds about right," he said. "Keep doing what you're doing, Mrs. Hartwell. I'll come back in 5 days if the road holds. If his temperature returns, send Nathan for me immediately, and do not wait." He picked up his coat. "And for what it's worth," he paused, looking at her with that direct, evaluating look again. "He would have been in significant trouble if you hadn't intervened when you did." He said it plainly, not effusively. Hennessy did not appear to do effusive, but plainly and seriously, the way a person said something they meant and wanted received without softening. Eliza nodded. She didn't say anything because she was not certain what she would say, and she had learned that moments like this were better received in silence than papered over with words. Nathan walked the doctor out. Eliza went back to the kitchen. She stood at the stove with her back to the room and put the last of the venison on for supper and kept her hands busy because keeping her hands busy was how she got through moments when the weight of the last 4 days caught up with her all at once, the way weight did when you finally stopped moving long enough for it to find you. She heard Nathan come back in. She heard him stop in the kitchen doorway. "He said you saved him," Nathan said. She kept her eyes on the pot. "Hennessy tends to be direct. He said without the nutrition intervention, the fever would have..." Nathan stopped. "He said another few days." "I know," Eliza said. Silence. Then, "I told you to leave." "Yes," she said. "The night you arrived. I told you." "Nathan." She turned around. He was standing in the doorway exactly as he'd stood on the first night, arms crossed, jaw set. But the similarity ended there. The certainty was gone. What was behind his eyes now was something rawer than certainty, something that looked a lot like a man seeing clearly for the first time what had almost happened because of what he'd almost done. "I know what you said," she told him, "and I know why you said it. You were frightened and you were exhausted, and I walked in looking like nothing that was going to help you. I understand all of that." He looked at her. "That's not an excuse." "No," she agreed. "It's not." He uncrossed his arms, put one hand on the doorframe and looked at the floor, and then back up at her. "I owe you an apology, a real one." She waited. "I made assumptions about what you were and what you were worth before I had any reason to," he said. "I made them the second you walked through the door. I made them because you were a woman of a certain age with no credentials and no reputation, and I was scared and I was angry, and I needed something to push against, and you were there." He said it steadily, looking at her. "That was wrong. I was wrong. And I'm sorry." Eliza held his gaze. She'd expected an apology at some point. She wasn't surprised by it, but she was surprised by the quality of it. There was no performance in it. No self-exoneration dressed up as confession. Just the thing itself, offered without expectation of being told it was fine. "Thank you," she said, "for saying it that way." He nodded once. Something shifted in his face. Not relief exactly. more like the particular quiet of a man who has put something down that he's been carrying for several days and is only now noticing how much it weighed. Supper that night was different from the previous nights. Not dramatically different. They were still 3 people in a cold house at the edge of a frozen ridge, still rationing what they had, still uncertain of what the next weeks would look like. But Caleb was at the table, which he'd insisted on, and he'd combed his hair, and he'd found a flannel shirt from somewhere that was warmer than what he'd had on that morning. He ate a full bowl of the venison stew without being watched for it, without either of them monitoring his swallows. He ate the way a man ate when he was eating because he was hungry, which was the most encouraging thing Eliza had seen in days. Nathan talked at supper. Actually talked. Not the clipped, functional exchanges of the past days, but conversation. He talked about Denver, and the business arrangement he'd walked away from to come here, and how he wasn't certain anymore that he'd been right to care so much about it. Caleb listened. He didn't say much, but the listening he did was the listening of a father hearing his son say something true for the first time in a long while. And that quality of listening was visible if you knew how to look for it. Eliza mostly ate her food and let them have it. It wasn't hers, this conversation. It had been waiting a long time to happen, longer than she'd been here, and all it had needed was the particular condition of people being too tired and too relieved to keep their guards up. She was glad to be in the room for it. That was enough. After supper, Caleb said he was tired, which was the first time he'd admitted to tiredness without being told to admit it, and went back to bed on his own. Nathan cleared the table, which was also new. Eliza washed the bowls. The kitchen had a different feel to it now than the kitchen she'd walked into 4 nights ago. Not just cleaner, though it was that, but inhabited differently. As if the room had remembered what it was for. She was hanging the cloth to dry when Nathan said, "What will you do now?" She looked at him. "He's recovering," Nathan said. He was drying a bowl, not looking at her. "Hennessy confirmed what you already knew. You came for a housekeeping position, and you've done," he set the bowl down, "you've done considerably more than that. I imagine you could leave if you wanted to. Take the wage and go. No one would question it." "Do you want me to leave?" she asked. He looked at her then, with the directness he'd had from the beginning, but that now had nothing combative behind it. "No," he said. I think this ranch needs someone like you. I think my father needs someone like you. And I think—" He stopped, started again. "I think I'd been wrong about what kind of strength this place needed. I thought it needed what I could give it: capital, decisions, someone who could assess the situation and act." He looked around the kitchen. But what it actually needed was someone who could look at what was left and know what to do with it. Eliza dried her hands on the cloth. She thought about the pantry on the first night, the bones and the dried beans and the 3 soft onions. She thought about what Nathan had called scraps and what she had called materials. The difference between those 2 words was not small. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I answered an advertisement for a position, and I intend to fulfill it. Even after, I don't hold things against people who apologize properly," she said. "And you apologized properly." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a generous standard." "It's a practical one," she said. "I don't have the energy for grudges." He picked up the dried bowl and put it on the shelf. Then he picked up the next one and dried it, and put that away too. They finished the dishes together without talking more, which was comfortable in the way that shared work was comfortable when the people doing it had gotten past the worst of what they'd needed to get past. She went to check on Caleb before she went to the small room at the end of the hall. Her room now, officially. The room Nathan had cleared of old equipment and found a proper pillow for. The room she'd been too busy to actually sleep in until last night. Caleb was in bed and nearly asleep, but not quite. He opened his eyes when she came to the doorway. "He apologized," Caleb said. Not a question. He'd probably heard it from the hallway. Old houses carried sound in their walls. "He did," she said. "Good." He closed his eyes. He needed to do that more than you needed to hear it. She thought about that. "Maybe," she said. "But I needed to hear it too." He didn't answer. His breathing had already taken on the slow depth of proper sleep. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at him. The color in his face that hadn't been there 4 days ago. The steadiness of his chest rising and falling. The large scarred hands on the blanket no longer trembling. He looked, she thought, like a man who expected to wake up tomorrow, which was perhaps the most fundamental definition of not dying. She pulled the door almost closed and went to her room. She lay down on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling. The house made its small sounds. Outside, the new front was coming in. She could hear it at the edges of things, the pressure change, the way the cold announced itself. It would snow again before morning. The roads would close again. They would be back to making do with what they had. She found she didn't mind. She reached to the bedside table and picked up Frederick's journal and held it without opening it. She didn't need to read it tonight. She just wanted the weight of it, the particular solidity of all those pages, his handwriting in the margins, the strip of cloth marker between the pages, the small pressed herbs that still, even now, gave up something faint and dry when she brought it close. She thought about what Hennessy had said, what Nathan had said, what Caleb had said, in his plain and unadorned way, on the first morning, "You're not going to leave, are you?" She hadn't known the answer then, not fully. She'd said what she believed, "Not until you don't need me." But that was different from knowing. Knowing was something that arrived later, after you'd done the thing, after you'd sat through the nights and cooked the bones and watched someone breathe their way back from the edge of a long fall. Knowing was what was left when the emergency was over and you were still there. She was still there. She put the journal on the table and turned onto her side and looked at the dark window, the cold glass, the faint lightning of clouds that meant snow coming, and let herself, for the first time in 4 days, simply rest. The snow came in the night, as she'd known it would, and by morning Blackthorn Ridge was buried under 8 fresh inches, with more coming sideways off the north face of the ridge. Eliza stood at the kitchen window with her first cup of hot water. Still no coffee, that would have to wait for the supply run, and looked at the white weight of it pressing down on everything and felt, unexpectedly, something close to peace. She had always been better in enclosed spaces than she let people know. The winters that broke other people had never broken her. There was something about the enforced stillness of a hard snow, the way it took the world's noise and buried it, the way it made the inside of a house feel deliberate and chosen rather than just where you happened to be. That suited some deep, quiet part of her. Frederick had laughed at her for it. "You're the only person I know," he'd said once, watching her look out at a blizzard with that same expression she was wearing now, who looks genuinely pleased when the roads close. She heard Caleb before she saw him. Steadier, still careful, still the footsteps of a man minding his own body, but the hesitation in them was less. He came into the kitchen dressed fully. Shirt, suspenders, the flannel vest he'd found somewhere the day before, and his hair was combed and he had the look of a man who had slept through the night and was surprised to find it had done what sleep was supposed to do. "Coffee," he said, looking at the stove. "Not yet," she said. "Supply run has to wait on the weather." He made the sound men made when they wanted to complain about something, but recognized the complaint had nowhere to go. He sat down at the table. "How long?" 2 days, maybe 3. She turned from the window. "I found some dried chicory in the back of the spice drawer. It's not coffee, but it's hot and it's bitter, which I understand is the part you actually need." Caleb looked at her. "You found chicory in my spice drawer." "You had a great deal of things in that spice drawer," she said. "Some of it I could identify." He almost smiled. "And the rest?" "I left it where it was," she said. "Didn't want to be wrong about anything important." She made the chicory and put a cup in front of him, and he drank it without objecting, which she counted as progress on multiple fronts. Nathan came in from outside. He'd been to the barn, she'd heard the door earlier, bringing cold air and the smell of horses and hay and the particular aliveness of someone who'd been moving in the cold. He stopped when he saw his father at the table. "You're up early," Nathan said. "I live here," Caleb said. Nathan poured himself a cup of the chicory without asking what it was and sat down. And for a while the 3 of them sat in the kitchen while the snow came down outside and the stove worked and nobody felt the need to fill the silence with anything. It was, Eliza thought, the most normal the house had felt since she arrived. Not fixed. She wasn't confused about that. You didn't fix something like this in a week. But the particular kind of broken it had been when she walked through the door, the brittle, stretched-too-thin broken of a household that had stopped believing in itself, that had softened into something more workable. She made porridge. Caleb ate 2 full servings and didn't ask permission for the second one, just reached for the pot, which she took as an excellent sign and said nothing about. Nathan ate standing up, which he apparently always did when he had something on his mind. She'd noticed this pattern over the last few days, the way he stood when he was thinking and sat when he'd settled something. "I need to talk to both of you about the ranch," he said. Caleb set down his spoon. Nathan put his cup on the counter and turned around. He had the look of someone who'd been working up to something for a while and had decided that this morning, with the snow providing a kind of captive audience and nowhere else to be, was when it was going to happen. "Before I came here," he said, "I'd been in contact with a man in Denver, a land broker. His name is Aldrich." Caleb said nothing. His face had gone careful. "He approached me 8 months ago," Nathan continued. "When Father mentioned in a letter that the ranch had been a difficult year, Aldrich had clients interested in the valley, the grazing land, the water access. He made an offer." He paused. "I didn't tell Father because I hadn't decided what to think about it. I told myself I was waiting for the right time." The kitchen was very quiet. "How much?" Caleb said. Nathan told him. Caleb looked at the table. His hands were on either side of his bowl, flat on the wood, and she could see something happening in him. The effort to stay still, to not react the way his body wanted to react, which she suspected involved the word Aldrich rather forcefully. "That's less than the land is worth," he said finally. "I know. The water rights alone are worth more than that." "I know that too," Nathan said. "I wasn't seriously considering it, but I didn't say no either, and Aldrich took that as an opening. He's been writing." He crossed his arms. "When I came here and saw how things were, how bad things were, I thought maybe it was the practical thing, that maybe the ranch was—" He stopped. "Finished," Caleb said. The word came out flat and hard. "I wasn't certain it wasn't," Nathan said, and at least he said it looking directly at his father, not softening it, not hiding behind a careful phrase. "Father, you'd been ill for months. The hands had gone for winter. The supplies were nearly gone. I thought—" He stopped again. "I was wrong about what I thought." Caleb looked at him for a long moment. There was something in his face that Eliza couldn't read cleanly. It was layered, a father's face. When a son said something painful and honest in the same breath, the difficulty of separating the sting from the respect. "Did you write to Aldrich?" he said. "From here?" "I wrote to tell him I needed more time." "That's not the same as no." "No," Nathan said. "It isn't." The silence stretched. Outside, the snow kept coming. The fire in the stove made its steady, neutral sound, and Eliza sat very still in her chair and felt the weight of the room and said nothing, because this was not her conversation to enter. She was here, she was witness to it. That was her role right now. Caleb picked up his spoon, looked at it, set it back down. "I built this ranch," he said, "not inherited it, not bought it with somebody else's money. I came here in 1851 with 2 horses and a wagon, and I broke this ground myself." He looked at his hands. I know it's just land. I know that's what some people think, that it's just land and there's always more land." He looked up at Nathan. "But I made something here. Your mother is buried on this land. I made something here that was supposed to—" He stopped. "I know," Nathan said. "Do you?" "I do," Nathan said. "More than I did a week ago." Something passed between them. Eliza felt it without seeing it exactly. The specific current that ran between fathers and sons who were not practiced at honesty with each other, but were trying it anyway, cautiously, the way you tried weight-bearing on an old injury. "Write to Aldrich," Caleb said. "Tell him no." "I will," Nathan said. "Today." "The roads, the letter can wait for the roads, the writing can't." Caleb looked at his son steadily. "You put it in writing today, so there's no question later about what was decided and when. That's how you do things that matter." Nathan held his father's gaze. "All right," he said. He sat down at the table. He sat down across from his father and picked up his cup of chicory, and the two of them looked at each other for a moment with the particular expression of people who have been having the wrong conversation for a long time and have just found, accidentally, the right one. "Tell me what it needs," Nathan said. "The ranch. All of it. What's been let go, what needs doing first. Tell me everything." Caleb picked up his spoon again. "That'll take a while." "We've got 2 days of snow," Nathan said. "I'm not going anywhere." It did take a while. It took most of the morning, actually. Caleb talking and Nathan listening and then asking questions with the practical, focused intelligence he had, which was real even when it had been pointed in the wrong direction. Eliza moved around the kitchen, cleaning, organizing the pantry. Reorganizing, really, making it make sense, finding things in the back that had been buried and forgotten and bringing them forward. And she listened to the conversation the way she listened to most things, with the outer surface of her attention while the inner part was on the work. She heard about the north fence line that had been damaged in October and not fully repaired. The well cover that needed replacing before spring thaw made the water questionable. The hay supply in the barn that was adequate for now but would need replenishing before March. The account at Garvey's store in Harrow Creek. Not delinquent, Caleb was precise about that. Not delinquent, but thin. The fact that the two hands who'd worked the ranch through the summer had been let go in November because there wasn't the cash to keep them on through winter, and whether either of them would come back in spring would depend on how the word had spread about the state of things. She heard Nathan process all of this. Not with the quick dismissiveness of the man who'd arrived at the door 5 days ago, but carefully, the way he'd read Frederick's journal, line by line, giving each item its due weight. The water rights, Nathan said at one point. You mentioned Aldrich knew about the water rights. Everybody in the valley knows about the water rights, Caleb said. The creek that runs through the north pasture feeds 3 other properties downstream. It's been a gentleman's agreement since before I came here. Nobody claims exclusive rights. Everyone uses what they need. No one cuts anyone off. He paused. Aldrich's clients would not keep that agreement. You know that for certain? I know the type, Caleb said. Men who buy land to resell it in pieces care about legal title, not agreements. They'd claim the water rights, fence the creek, and the Harmon place and the Dillett farm would be dry inside of 2 years. Nathan was quiet. And the county wouldn't intervene? The county does what it does, Caleb said, which isn't always what it should. He looked at his hands. Which is why the answer to Aldrich is no, regardless of the number. Eliza was in the back of the pantry when she found it. She almost didn't. It was behind a broken crate in the far corner, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine, a flat rectangular package that could have been anything. She pulled it out carefully, unwrapped the oilcloth, and found herself holding a ledger. Not just any ledger. She opened it carefully. The pages were dry and intact, the writing inside it neat and consistent, and understood immediately what she was looking at. Caleb's records, years of them. The ranch's income and expenditures laid out in clean columns going back to 1861, every transaction, every purchase, every sale of cattle, every repair, every payment made and received, right up to what appeared to be October of 1882, 2 months ago. She brought it out to the table. Caleb stopped talking. He looked at the ledger in her hands. This was in the back of the pantry, she said, behind a crate. He took it from her slowly. He opened it and looked at the pages the way people looked at things they'd forgotten about and were relieved to find, not surprised, just relieved, the relief of something still existing that you'd half believed might have been lost. I put this back there last spring, he said, before the fever started being bad. I was afraid. He stopped. Afraid of what? Nathan said. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Of someone getting into the house when I was too sick to stop them, he said. I know that sounds... No, Nathan said. It doesn't. Eliza looked at him. I was looking at the ledger with an expression she recognized now. The expression he got when something recalibrated in him, when the version of events he'd been carrying had to be revised. She could see him revising. His father, ill and alone and afraid, hiding his records in the back of the pantry because he didn't know who might come to the door and couldn't protect himself and hadn't told anyone. May I? Nathan reached for the ledger. Caleb handed it over. Nathan looked through it for a long time. The kitchen was quiet except for the snow against the windows and the fire and the occasional sound of Nathan turning pages. Eliza put the noon meal on. Potato soup made from 4 potatoes she'd found at the bottom of a burlap sack in the pantry reorganization, thin but warming, and set the table around the ledger that Nathan had laid flat to look at more carefully. This is better than I thought, Nathan said finally. What do you mean? Caleb said. The account at Garvey's. The cattle sales from August. Nathan turned the ledger so his father could see the column he was pointing at. I assumed the situation was worse than this. From your letters. My letters were honest, Caleb said. Your letters said it was a difficult year. I read that as... Nathan stopped. I assumed difficult meant dire. I think I assumed worse than was true because I was already... He stopped again. Already looking for reasons, Caleb said. Nathan didn't disagree. The ranch isn't in ruin, Caleb said. He said it without reproach, just as a plain statement of fact. It's had a hard winter and the owner has been sick. Those are real problems, but it's not in ruin. No, Nathan said, it isn't. Eliza served the soup. She served it and sat down and ate her own without making any comment, because what was happening between these two men at this table was something she understood better than she could have explained. The particular work of a relationship, finding its actual shape after a long time of both people operating on assumptions about what the shape was. Nathan brought out a sheet of paper from his coat pocket after lunch. He sat down and wrote the letter to Aldrich while Caleb watched from across the table, not reading it, just watching the act of Nathan writing it. And when Nathan was done, he handed it to his father without being asked. Caleb read it. He read it twice. Then he put it on the table and looked at Nathan and said, "Good." Just that. Good. And Nathan folded the letter and put it back in his pocket to wait for the road, and some part of the last week settled into something that could be lived with. The afternoon moved the way January afternoons moved, slowly, with purpose, no particular drama in it. Nathan spent several hours in the barn working on something with the fence posts. She could hear intermittent sounds of hammering and the occasional noise of an obstacle, met and addressed. Caleb spent an hour at the kitchen table with the ledger and a pencil, adding figures she suspected had been in his head and not on paper, things he'd noted mentally during the months of being too ill to sit up and write them down. He did this quietly and steadily, and without asking for company. Eliza cleaned the second bedroom, not hers, the room across from Caleb's that had been used for storage until Nathan arrived, which Nathan had been sleeping in on a narrow cot that was not adequate and he had not complained about. She moved the remaining boxes to the back wall, found a real bed frame behind two crates, spent 40 minutes figuring out how to reassemble it. She got the frame up on the second attempt, having figured out the first time what she'd done wrong, and put the better mattress from the storage pile on top of it. She found extra blankets at the top of the bedroom wardrobe, shook them out, aired them as best she could by opening the window 2 inches into the cold and shutting it again quickly. When Nathan came in from the barn, she was in the kitchen starting supper and she told him she'd fix the room. He went to look and came back and said, "You didn't have to do that." "I was cleaning anyway," she said. Still, she turned around. He was standing in the kitchen doorway in the way he sometimes stood, blocking it slightly, as if he was still making up his mind whether to come in or stay at the edge. She had noticed this was how Nathan Whitmore operated when he was about to say something he hadn't fully prepared. He needed a door to stand near. "I've been thinking about the spring," he said. She waited. "When the hands come back, if they come back, there's going to be more work than Father can manage while he's still recovering. More than I can manage alone without knowing the land." He looked at the floor, then back up. "I don't know how long you were intending to stay. When you answered the advertisement, you weren't..." He stopped, started differently. "The position was housekeeper. What you've been doing is considerably more than that." "I know what the position was," she said. "I want to pay you accordingly." "We can discuss wages when your father is well enough to be part of the conversation," she said. "This is his ranch." Nathan nodded. "Fair." He paused. "But you're staying." "That's not really a question," she said. "No," he said. "I suppose it isn't." He came the rest of the way into the kitchen and picked up the second paring knife she'd left on the counter. She'd been peeling the last of the potatoes, and without any particular conversation about it, he started peeling beside her. He was not especially good at it. He took too much with the peel. She didn't say anything. Participation mattered more than efficiency in her experience, and efficiency usually followed once participation became a habit. Caleb came to the kitchen for supper on his own, same as the night before, and ate a full meal and participated in the conversation and did not look, in Eliza's assessment, like a man who was still in danger of anything except maybe overextending himself in his impatience to recover. After supper, he sat at the table for a while and talked about the north pasture, the specific geography of it, the place where the fence had gone down, the particular quality of the ground in that section in spring when the snowmelt came off the ridge. He talked about it the way people talked about things they loved without being able to say they loved them. In specifics, in the particular details that only came from long attention. Nathan listened. He asked questions. Caleb answered them and then asked questions back. What Nathan had done in Denver, the business that had occupied him, whether he had found it satisfying. Nathan was quiet for a moment before answering that one. I found it successful, Nathan said finally. That's not the same thing. No, Caleb said. It isn't. I didn't know the difference until recently, Nathan said. He was looking at the table. I thought they were the same. Success meaning you'd done the right thing. Turned out success just means you'd done the effective thing. The right thing is separate. Caleb looked at his son for a long moment. Your mother would have liked you, he said, the way you are now. It was the most direct thing he'd said in 4 days of increasing directness, and the weight of it sat in the room differently than anything else had. Nathan didn't answer. He looked at his father with an expression Eliza turned away from because it was not hers to see. Too raw, too specific, the face of a man who had been waiting his whole life for a version of that sentence and had stopped expecting it. She busied herself at the stove. After a while, the conversation resumed, quieter, and she let it move without her. She washed the supper things and put the kitchen right for morning and checked that the stove had enough wood for the night. She went to look in on the front room, which she'd been slowly bringing to order. The dust she'd beaten out of the furniture, the floor she'd swept, the small repairs she'd made to what she could with what was available. The room was not impressive. It was not comfortable in the way rooms were comfortable when they'd been well maintained for years. But it was clean, and it was organized, and it had the particular dignity of a space that someone had decided to take seriously. She came back to the kitchen doorway. Caleb and Nathan were still at the table. Caleb was showing Nathan something in the ledger, pointing at a column with his finger, explaining something about the notation system he'd used over the years. Nathan was leaning over looking at it with his reading expression, the one where his attention went fully into the page. She watched them for a moment. Then she took her shawl from the hook and went to her room. She didn't feel lonely. That was the thing she noticed as she sat on the edge of her bed and took off her shoes. She had expected to, these first weeks in a new place. She'd felt lonely sharply and consistently in the 14 months since Frederick died. The specific loneliness of someone who had been half of a pair for a long time and had forgotten what it felt like to be only themselves. But tonight she sat in the small room at the end of the hall and listened to the murmur of father and son talking in the kitchen and the sound of the snow outside and the solid, patient sounds of the house, and she did not feel lonely. She felt, if she was honest about it, useful, which was not the same as happy. She was too clear-eyed to confuse the two, but was, she had decided sometime in the last few years, the foundation of it. The thing that happiness could be built on if you were patient and practical and didn't require it to arrive all at once. She picked up Frederick's journal. She opened it not to the marked pages but to the back, where he'd left blank pages for notes he hadn't taken yet. And she found the pencil she'd brought in from the kitchen, and she wrote. Not much. Just the date and a few lines. Caleb ate a full supper. Nathan wrote the letter. The snow is still coming down. The house is warmer than it was. She looked at what she'd written. Then she added, I think I'm going to be all right here. She closed the journal. She lay down. The house settled around her the way houses settled when they'd decided the people inside them were worth the effort of holding. In the kitchen, the voices went on for another hour. She didn't catch the words, just the rhythm of them. Caleb's slower cadence, Nathan's quicker one, the sound of a conversation that had been a long time arriving and was in no hurry now to be done. At some point the ledger was put away, and the lamp was turned down, and the house went quiet. In the way that houses went quiet at the end of days that had mattered. Outside, the snow was finally stopping. She could tell by the change in the silence, the absence of the soft, constant sound of it against the glass, the slight shift in the quality of the dark. Tomorrow the world would be white and still, and the roads would need another day at least, and there would be work to do and plans to make and a ranch to begin to put back together. But that was tomorrow. Tonight the house was quiet, and the fire was banked, and the 3 people in it had made it through another day, which was, in the end, what any day asked of you. Just to make it through to the next one, carrying what you had, using what you knew, staying at the table even when the table was bare, because bare tables were only the beginning of something if you had the patience to wait and see what they could hold. The roads cleared on a Tuesday. Eliza knew it before anyone told her because she heard the sound of a wagon in the distance, the first wagon sound in 11 days. And then Nathan was pulling on his coat and saying he'd go into Harrow Creek for supplies, and did she have a list? She had a list. She'd been adding to it since the third day of the second snowfall, the careful accumulative list of someone who had learned not to wait until she was out of something before she thought about needing it. She gave him the list. He looked at it. He looked at her. "This is very thorough," he said. "It's what we need for the next 3 weeks," she said, "assuming another storm comes through, which Caleb says it will." "He's usually right about the weather," Nathan said. "I know, he told me." Nathan folded the list and put it in his breast pocket and went out. She heard the horse, then the gate, then nothing. The silence after he left was different from the silence of the snowbound days. It had space in it, possibility, the particular openness of a world that had reconnected with itself. Caleb was at the table with the ledger again. He'd been at it most mornings, working through the winter accounts, making notes in the margins in his careful small handwriting. His color was fully normal now. His hands were steady. He's still tired in the afternoons, and he still didn't like admitting it. And their negotiation on that subject, she'd insist on an hour of rest after the midday meal. He'd object. She'd ignore the objection. He'd take the rest and feel better for it and not thank her, had become something like a ritual, the kind of mild ongoing argument that functioned as a form of affection between people who didn't do affection easily. "He took the list," Caleb said without looking up from the ledger. "He did." "All of it?" "He didn't argue about any of it," she said, which I took as a yes. Caleb looked up. There was something in his expression she'd come to recognize. The look he got when Nathan did something that surprised him, that didn't match the version of Nathan he'd been carrying. He got it more often now than he had 2 weeks ago, and each time he got it, the surprise was slightly less, and the recognition slightly more, which was how recalibration worked when it was working. "Good," he said, and went back to the ledger. She made bread. She had enough flour now, just enough for a proper loaf, and she wanted to have something in the house that smelled like itself when Nathan got back. She'd noticed this about herself over the last 2 weeks, the way she'd started thinking about the house as a thing to maintain in a particular state, not just functionally, but in terms of what it felt like to walk into it. She kept the kitchen warm. She kept something on the stove. Small things. The kind of thing that accumulated invisibly, and then one day was the difference between a house and a home. She wasn't sure when she'd started thinking of Blackthorn Ridge as something to build rather than a place to survive. She thought it might have been the night she'd added those lines to the back of Frederick's journal. "I think I am going to be all right here." Writing it had done something to her. She'd never been superstitious about words, never believed that saying a thing made it true, but she'd come to believe that saying a thing could make it possible, could open a space for it to be true in, and that was different and worth respecting. Hennessy came by that afternoon, riding in ahead of Nathan's return, his saddlebag full of whatever business a doctor on the frontier had on a Tuesday when the roads had just cleared. He came in and shook Caleb's hand and examined him with the same brisk efficiency as the first visit, and then sat down at the kitchen table and drank the chicory Eliza gave him without complaint, which told her something about the kind of man he was. "You're recovered," he told Caleb. "I want to be clear. Recovered doesn't mean back to what you were in September. You'll need to build that back slowly. The lungs are clear, but they've been stressed and they'll be susceptible for the rest of the winter. Cold air, heavy exertion, both of those need to be rationed." "She's been telling me that for 2 weeks," Caleb said, looking at Eliza. Hennessy looked at her too. "She's right," he said. "Listen to her." "I do listen to her." "More than you think you do," Eliza said, "and less than you should. You're at about 60%. Caleb made his sound. Hennessy appeared to find this privately amusing. He set down his cup and said, "Mrs. Hartwell, I want to speak to something." He said it in the particular way that meant he'd been thinking about it for a while and had decided the roads clearing was the right moment. "I have a patient in the valley, a woman named Dora Harmon. She's at the Harmon place, 2 miles east. Her husband thinks she has a chest cold that won't clear. I've seen her twice, and I think it's more complicated than that. But she's frightened of physicians and won't let me do a full examination." Eliza looked at him. "She might let another woman in," Hennessy said. "Someone who wasn't arriving as the official doctor." "I'm not a nurse," Eliza said. "I want to be clear about that before you send me anywhere." "I know what you are and what you aren't," Hennessy said. "I've thought about that. What I need isn't a nurse. I need someone who can observe the patient properly and report back to me with enough detail to treat her accurately. He paused. And someone who knows what they're looking at, which you do. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at Caleb. Don't look at me, Caleb said. I can manage an afternoon on my own. That's not why I'm looking at you. Then why? She wasn't entirely sure. Maybe because this was his house, and something had shifted in her sense of what required his awareness, some instinct toward transparency that she'd developed over the last 2 weeks. Maybe because she wanted to see his face when she said yes, to confirm what she thought she already knew. She turned back to Hennessy. I'll go, she said. Tomorrow morning, if the road holds. Hennessy nodded. I'll send word to Harmon tonight. He stayed another half hour, talking to Caleb about the spring conditions and the likelihood of a hard melt and what that would do to the north pasture drainage. And then he left in the early afternoon with the particular purposeful efficiency of a man who had 6 more stops before dark. Eliza watched him go from the kitchen window and thought about Dora Harmon and what a woman who was frightened of physicians looked like, what she needed from another woman who arrived at her door, and began quietly to make a list of a different kind. Nathan got back before supper with the wagon loaded and his face cold and his expression carrying the particular satisfaction of a man who had completed a practical task efficiently. He backed the wagon to the kitchen door and they unloaded it together. Caleb tried to help and was told firmly by both of them to sit down, which he did with the specific expression of a man obeying under protest, and they brought in flour and dried beans and salt pork and coffee. Real coffee. Finally, the smell of it coming off the sack when Eliza lifted it was something she hadn't realized how much she'd missed. And 2 pounds of sugar and a side of cured bacon and lamp oil and a bundle of dried apples that she hadn't put on the list, but that Nathan had apparently decided on his own to include. She looked at the dried apples. Mrs. Garvey said they were good this year, Nathan said. He was lifting a sack of cornmeal. He said it without looking at her, casually, the way you mentioned a thing when you didn't want to make too much of it. She put the dried apples on the shelf and didn't say anything, which was its own kind of answer. The pantry, full, looked like a different room from the one she'd stood in on the first night. It wasn't extravagant. There was nothing extravagant about it, just the solid, adequate provision of a household that intended to last the winter. But the adequacy of it had a weight she felt in her chest in a way she hadn't expected. She stood in front of the full shelves for a moment before she went back to the kitchen. Supper that night was the best meal she'd cooked since arriving. Salt pork and beans with real seasoning, cornbread from the new flour, dried apple compote with a little sugar that she put in a bowl in the center of the table almost as an afterthought, and that Caleb looked at with an expression she had not seen on his face yet. Pure, unguarded pleasure at a small thing. Apples, he said. Nathan brought them, she said. Caleb looked at his son. Nathan was looking at his cornbread, cutting it with the edge of his fork, not looking up. Good thinking, Caleb said. Mrs. Garvey recommended them, Nathan said. She has good judgment, Caleb said. They ate. The fire was good and the room was warm and the coffee was real, and Eliza sat at her place at the table and ate her own food and felt, with the particular precision of someone who had learned not to take things for granted, exactly what this was. Not perfect. Not finished. Not the resolution of everything. There were still hard things ahead, for all of them, the kind of hard things that didn't announce themselves until they arrived. There was still a ranch that needed more hands than it had, a fence line that needed work before spring, a relationship between a father and son that was finding its shape slowly and not without cost. There were still nights when she woke at 3 in the morning and the quiet was Frederick's absence rather than just quiet, and she lay in the dark and understood that grief did not end. It only changed shape, and sometimes the new shape was livable, and sometimes it pressed down hard. But tonight it was this, and this was enough, more than enough. It was the kind of enough that took work to make, and was therefore worth more than things that arrived easily. She told them about Hennessy's request over supper. Caleb listened without interrupting, which was how he listened when he was taking something seriously. Nathan put down his fork partway through and didn't pick it up again until she'd finished. The Harmon place, Caleb said. I know Ed Harmon. He's a good man. Stubborn about certain things. He paused. Getting a doctor to the house for his wife would be one of them, I imagine. Hennessy said she's afraid of physicians, Eliza said. Women out here often are, Caleb said. Not without reason. The ones who come through aren't always— He stopped, clearly thinking of Hennessy. Some of them are fine, others are less so. Hennessy is fine, Eliza said. Yes, but she doesn't know that yet. Nathan said, Is it safe for you to go alone? She looked at him. The road, he said. It just cleared. If another storm— 2 miles, she said. In the morning. I'll be back by midday. He looked like he wanted to say more. He picked his fork back up instead. She understood the impulse and she understood the checking of it, and she respected both. She went to the Harmon place the next morning with a covered basket containing a jar of the bean soup she'd made from the new supplies and a small bundle of the dried chamomile and 2 pieces of the cornbread left from supper. She hadn't planned the basket exactly. It had assembled itself while she was thinking about other things, her hands making the decisions her mind hadn't finished yet. Ed Harmon met her at the door. He was a large man, broad through the chest, with the look of someone who had been holding himself together by force of will for several weeks and was getting tired of the effort. He looked at Eliza on his doorstep with the slightly desperate assessment of a man who needed help and wasn't sure what kind she was. Hennessy sent you, he said. I'm Eliza Hartwell. I'm staying at the Whitmore Ranch. She held up the basket. I brought soup. He stepped back from the door. The inside of the Harmon house was dim and warm and had the specific quality of a space where one person was managing everything and not quite managing. There were 2 children, a boy of about 8 and a girl younger, 5 perhaps, who watched Eliza from the far side of the room with the solemn attention of children who had been frightened about something for long enough that wariness had become their resting state. Eliza nodded at them. The boy nodded back gravely. The girl pressed closer to her brother. Dora Harmon was in the bedroom. She was younger than Eliza had expected, early 30s, dark-haired, with the thin, exhausted look of someone who had been sick long enough to start forgetting what not sick felt like. She looked at Eliza in the doorway with a wariness that was different from the children's, more layered. Not just fear, but something protective in it, the expression of a woman who had learned that strangers arriving with help sometimes meant a different kind of trouble. I'm not a doctor, Eliza said from the doorway. She didn't come into the room yet. I'm not going to examine you the way Dr. Hennessy would. I just came to see how you are. And I brought soup, which you don't have to eat if you don't want to. A long pause. What kind? Dora said. Bean, with salt pork. Another pause, then, come in. Eliza came in. She sat in the chair beside the bed, the same chair she'd spent so many hours in at Caleb's bedside. And she looked at Dora Harmon and let herself be looked at, which was important, she'd learned. People who were sick and frightened needed to assess you before they could accept anything from you. They needed to know you weren't performing. The only way to show that was to stop performing and just be there. They talked for 2 hours. Or rather, Dora talked and Eliza listened, with the particular quality of listening she'd developed over years of being in rooms with people who needed to be heard before they could be helped. Dora talked about the cough that had started in October and hadn't gone, about the nights when it woke her, and the mornings when it took an hour to settle, about the tiredness that was different from the normal tiredness of a woman with 2 children and a farm. Deeper, more fundamental, the tiredness of a body, spending all its resources on something other than living. She talked about her fear of doctors, which was specific and based on experience rather than general anxiety, rooted in a physician she'd encountered years before who had been careless with her in a way she'd never fully recovered from. She talked about Ed, who was frightened and didn't know how to show it as anything other than practicality, pushing her to see Hennessy because that was what Ed did with fear, converted it into action and expected action to fix it. Eliza listened to all of it. She didn't minimize any of it. She asked questions carefully, the kind of questions Frederick had taught her to ask. Not the questions that gathered data for a diagnosis, but the questions that helped a person organize their own experience into something that could be looked at. At the end of the 2 hours, she had a clear enough picture to tell Hennessy what he needed to know. She also had a clearer picture of something else. Dora Harmon was not as bad as Ed Harmon's fear had made it seem, and not as manageable as Dora Harmon's own coping had made it seem. She was somewhere in the middle, sick enough to need proper treatment, not so sick that treatment was out of reach. Hennessy is a careful man, Eliza said before she left. I've watched him work. He's not going to— She stopped, choosing words. He listens. That's what I noticed. He listens to what people tell him before he decides what to do. Dora looked at her hands. You don't have to decide anything today, Eliza said. I'll tell him what you told me. What he does with it is between you and him. Dora looked up. You'll tell him to listen first? I will, Eliza said, and he will. She rode back to Blackthorn Ridge in the late morning with the empty basket and a great deal to think about. She thought about Dora Harmon's face when she'd come into the room versus when she'd left. The measured, careful opening of a person who had decided, provisionally, to try trust again. She thought about how fragile that was, and how much it was worth, and how the most important thing she'd done this morning had nothing to do with medicine. She thought about what she was becoming, here at the edge of this valley, in the brutal middle of this winter. She'd come as a housekeeper. She'd arrived and found a dying man and a frightened son, and a house that had given up on itself. And she had done what she'd always done when she found something in that state. She had looked at what was there and decided it was enough to work with. She had not always been this way. She wanted to be honest about that, at least with herself. She had been, for much of her younger life, as susceptible as anyone to the idea that value was determined by what you'd been given. The education, the title, the credential, the visible marker of worth. Frederick had helped with that, not by telling her she was wrong, but by showing her over years what he valued and why. He valued what a person could do with what they had. He valued the question, what is this for? Applied to every resource, every piece of knowledge, every difficult moment. He valued the refusal to call something useless before you'd thought hard about what it might be used for. She had internalized that. She hadn't known she had until she stood in the pantry of Blackthorn Ridge on a freezing night and looked at bones and dried beans and 3 soft onions and felt, not despair, but the specific calm of someone looking at materials. That was Frederick's gift to her. Not the journal, though the journal mattered, the way of seeing. She was going to keep using it. Caleb was in the front room when she got back, sitting in the chair by the window with Frederick's journal open in his hands. He looked up when she came in, and she stopped in the doorway and looked at the journal, and he looked at her looking at it. Nathan found it on the shelf, he said. I asked if I could look. He held it up slightly. I hope it's fine, she said. And it was. She was surprised to discover it was completely fine. He closed it carefully and held it out to her. The margin notes, he said. The handwriting's small. He was careful with paper, she said. She took the journal and held it. There's a note near the back, Caleb said. In different handwriting. She looked at him. I didn't read it, he said. Just saw it was there. Different hand. She opened the journal to the back pages. She found what she'd written 2 weeks ago and read it again. Caleb ate a full supper. Nathan wrote the letter. The snow is still coming down. The house is warmer than it was. I think I am going to be all right here. That's mine, she said. Caleb nodded. He didn't ask what it said. She wasn't sure whether she'd have told him if he had. Some things were private not because they were secret, but because they were still becoming, still finding their shape. And the becoming required a certain amount of shelter from observation. She put the journal in her apron pocket. How was the morning? Quiet, he said. Nathan was out working on the north fence line. She looked up. In this cold? He bundled up. He wanted to see the damage for himself. Caleb paused. He asked me this morning if I'd teach him the things I know about this land. The specific things. The drainage patterns, the grazing rotations. Which sections flood in spring and which sections dry out in August. He looked out the window. He said he'd spent years learning things that turned out to be less useful than he'd thought, and he wanted to learn something that would last. Eliza sat down in the other chair. What did you say? I said yes, Caleb said, simply, the way he said everything. They sat in the front room together for a while, the fire going, the afternoon light coming through the window in the pale, flat way it came in January. Outside she could hear Nathan somewhere. Not the north pasture, he'd come back by now, somewhere closer. The barn, maybe. The sound of work being done without being asked. She thought about something she wanted to say, something she'd been thinking about since the morning with Dora Harmon and had continued thinking about on the ride home. Hennessy will need to know what I observed, she said. I'll need to write it down properly, the way Frederick would have, so it's useful and not just impressionistic. Caleb looked at her. Can you do that? I've watched it done enough times to know how it's structured, she said. Whether I can do it the way a physician would is a different question, but I can do it well enough to be useful. And if he comes to you again, Caleb said, with another patient who won't see him directly. She was quiet for a moment. Then I'll go again, she said. Something settled in Caleb's expression. Not satisfaction exactly, more like recognition. The look of a man who had suspected something and had it confirmed. There's a lot of need in this valley, he said. Hennessy's a good doctor, but he's one man and some people won't come to him for reasons that don't have anything to do with his competence. I know, she said. You'd be filling a gap that isn't formally filled. I know that too. Frederick trained you, he said. Not as a question. He taught me what he knew, she said. He taught me because he believed in passing things on. He said knowledge that stayed with one person when it died was knowledge wasted. She looked at the window. I used to think he was being dramatic. He wasn't a dramatic man generally, but on that particular thing he was... She paused. He felt it, really felt it. Caleb was quiet. Then, sounds like he was right. He was right about most things, she said. Not everything. He could be stubborn about small things in ways that made no sense. She almost smiled. He had very specific opinions about how a bed should be made. We argued about that for 14 years and never resolved it. Caleb made his sound, the one that lived between amusement and acknowledgement. Margaret had opinions about the kitchen, he said, about where things went. I still put them in the wrong place sometimes, after all this time, because the wrong place was where she put them, and my hands learned it from her hands. It was the most he'd said about Margaret in all the weeks she'd been here. She didn't respond with anything except stillness, the particular quality of not filling the space, of letting the thing he'd said exist in the room without immediately being addressed. After a while he said, I'm glad you didn't leave. When Nathan told you to, he clarified, the first night. So am I, she said. Nathan came in at mid-afternoon with snow on his coat and his hands red from the cold, and a piece of the fence rail he'd broken off to show his father where the damage was worst. He laid it on the kitchen table, and Caleb looked at it with the eye of a man who knew wood, who could read the age of rot and the direction of pressure, and the difference between damage that was structural and damage that was only surface. And he told Nathan what it meant and what would be needed, and Nathan listened and then asked 3 specific, intelligent questions, and Caleb answered them. And Eliza made coffee, real coffee, the smell of it filling the kitchen in a way that made all 3 of them briefly stop and simply appreciate it, and put it on the table, and they sat. The fence rail sat between them like an object lesson. This is what the land gives you when you're not watching, it said. This is what winter does when you let your attention slip. This is what you inherit and what you have to decide to inherit properly. Nathan picked it up. He turned it over in his hands, looking at where the rot had started, the way Frederick would have turned a piece of evidence over. Not seeing a problem, but learning from it, reading it. Spring, he said. We do the whole north line in spring. Whole line, Caleb said, not just the damaged sections. Whole line, Nathan agreed. Caleb picked up his coffee cup. I'll teach you how to read the ground first, he said. Which posts are going to fail before they fail. You can tell that? With practice. A pause. It takes a few years to learn, but you can learn it. A few years. The phrase sat in the air with the particular weight of a long-term proposition, a statement about the future that assumed the future was available. Nathan heard it. She could see him hear it, the slight shift in his expression, the taking in of it. His father talking about years, plural, his father planning. All right, Nathan said. He set the fence rail down. Show me. Eliza drank her coffee and listened to them begin the lesson. Caleb talking about soil composition and frost lines and the particular behavior of the clay that ran under the north pasture. Nathan listening the way he listened now, which was differently than he'd arrived. The fence rail sat on the table between them. Outside the sun was dropping toward the ridge, and the long shadows of late January were reaching across the snow, and the valley was still and cold and entirely itself. She thought about Dora Harmon. She thought about the note she would write for Hennessy and how to write it. She thought about the spring and the fence line and what the ranch would look like when the snow pulled back and the ground came through and things that had been buried began to show what they were. She thought about a garden. She'd been thinking about it for about a week, experimentally, the way you thought about something you weren't ready to say out loud yet. Behind the kitchen, where the ground got afternoon sun, there was a space that had been used for something once. She could see the old outlines of it under the snow if she looked from the right angle. She'd asked Caleb about it, and he'd said Margaret had kept a kitchen garden there years ago, before Nathan was born, before the years of hard work and hard weather had crowded out the space and attention for it. She was going to put it back. Not this spring. This spring there was too much else to do, too much that needed doing before she could spend effort on something that was just for the living, the daily goodness of it. But she was going to put it back. She was going to work the ground in April when it was soft enough, and she was going to put in the things that mattered, tomatoes and beans and the onions she'd never run out of again, and something for the bees because the bees needed something too, and maybe something just for the color of it, just because a thing could be useful and also be beautiful, and there was no law against that. Frederick would have been pleased about the garden. He'd always wanted one, and they'd never had the ground for it. She would put it in for both of them. The afternoon became evening. She made supper, bacon and cornbread, and the last of the dried apple compote, which Caleb had been taking small servings of every day with the focused appreciation of a man who had been reminded that small pleasures were not small. And they ate at the table the way they ate now, the three of them, which was not with the forced quality of people enduring proximity, but with the settled quality of people who had found a rhythm and were living inside it. They talked about the fence and about the Harmon place when she mentioned it. Ed Harmon and Caleb had an old friendship she hadn't known about, going back to the early days of the valley, and Caleb was glad to hear Dora was being looked after. Nathan asked about Hennessy's manner with women patients and seemed reassured by what she told him. After supper, she wrote the note for Hennessy. She sat at the kitchen table with the lamp and a sheet of paper and wrote it carefully, the way she had watched Frederick write his clinical observations. Ordered, precise, without interpretation, the facts laid out in the sequence that would be most useful to someone who hadn't been in the room. She described Dora's symptoms as Dora had described them. She described what she'd observed directly, the quality of Dora's breathing, the color she'd noted, the pattern of the cough as Dora reported it. She described Dora's state of mind with the same care she described her physical state, because those two things were not separate, and Hennessy would need to know both. When she was done, she read it over twice and changed 2 words and signed it with her name. Caleb was in the doorway. She hadn't heard him come. "Can I read it?" he asked. She handed it to him. He stood in the doorway and read it with the same careful attention he gave everything, and when he was done, he held it for a moment before giving it back. "Frederick taught you well," he said. "I paid attention," she said. "That's mostly what it is. Paying attention and not deciding you already know before you've looked." He looked at her. "That's harder than it sounds." "Yes," she said. "It is." He went to bed. She sealed the note for Hennessy and put it on the shelf to send with the next rider into Harrow Creek. She washed the last of the supper dishes and put the kitchen right for morning and checked the fire and did all the small daily work that constituted the keeping of a house. The invisible labor of continuity. The 10,000 small actions that amounted to a life being lived on purpose. Nathan was at the door when she turned around. He'd been sitting at the table writing something of his own. The letter to Aldrich had gone 3 days ago. This was something else. She'd been too focused on her own writing to look. And he was folding it now, putting it in his pocket. "Letter to Denver," he said. "Telling them I'm staying." She looked at him. "For how long?" He thought about it. He looked at the folded letter in his hand and then at the kitchen and then at some middle distance that seemed to contain the answer. "I don't know yet," he said. "Long enough to learn the ground. Long enough to fix the fence line." He paused. "Long enough to be sure the place doesn't need me to leave." She understood what he meant. A relationship between a father and son who had spent years at a safe distance would need proximity to become something better, and proximity required time, and time required a decision about where to be. It was not a small thing, what he'd decided. It was the kind of decision that looked small from the outside and was enormous from the inside, the kind of thing that reshaped a life without announcing itself as doing so. "He'll be glad," she said. "He won't say so," Nathan said. "No," she said. "But you'll know." Nathan tucked the letter away. He looked at the kitchen, the clean table, the lamp, the note for Hennessy on the shelf, and then at her. "You've changed this place," he said. She shook her head slightly. "I mean it," he said. "And I don't mean this kitchen, though that too. I mean, he stopped, looking for words. When I got here, I thought I was coming to manage a crisis and then make a decision. I thought this was a problem to solve and then leave. And what you did, he stopped again. What you did was stay. That's what you did. You stayed, and you worked, and you didn't let me push you out, and you didn't ask for anything except the chance to be useful. And somehow that changed. He looked around the kitchen again. Everything. Eliza looked at him. She thought about the first night, the door opening and his face telling her she was not what was needed, the feeling of putting her suitcase down and taking off her coat and refusing to make the decision he'd already made for her. She thought about how tired she'd been, how deep the tiredness had gone. Not just the travel, but the tiredness of a person who had been surviving for over a year and was not entirely sure what came next, what surviving was supposed to build toward. I stayed because there was someone who needed someone to stay, she said. That's not complicated. It is, though, Nathan said. Most people don't. She thought about that. She thought about the pantry and the bones and the bags of dried beans and what you decided to see when you looked at them. She thought about Frederick writing Feed the Patient in the margins of someone else's book because he needed to argue with the version of medicine that had given up. She thought about Dora Harmon's face opening, provisionally, toward the possibility of trust. Some people walked into rooms and saw what was missing. She had spent most of her life being one of those people, and it had cost her in ways she was still accounting for. The thing she'd learned, slowly, imperfectly, still learning, was that the same room looked different depending on the question you brought to it. Not what is gone. What is here? What can this become? I don't know that it was courage, she said. I think it was practice. Learning to look at things the right way. Frederick helped with that. She paused. And I think... She stopped. What? Nathan said. I think I needed somewhere to be, she said, honestly. I think I needed a place that needed something I had. That's not selfless. I want to be honest about that. I needed this as much as it needed me. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then, I think that's how it usually works, he said. The things worth staying for. She nodded. She turned down the lamp. The kitchen settled into firelight, warm and dim and smelling of coffee and the ghost of supper and the wood smoke that had saturated the walls over years of winters. The accumulated smell of a house that had been alive a long time. Good night, Nathan, she said. Good night, Mrs. Hartwell. She went down the hall to her room. She lay down. She listened to the house. Caleb breathing steadily behind his closed door, Nathan moving in the kitchen for a few more minutes before going to his own room, the fire talking quietly to itself, the wind coming off the ridge with its cold and ancient sound, the same sound it had made before any of them were here and would make after. She lay there and thought about the garden. She thought about April ground, black and cold and willing. She thought about what she'd put in first, the things that could tolerate a late frost, the things that didn't need to be coddled. She thought about the first green things showing in the dirt outside the kitchen window, and what Caleb's face would do when he saw them, the particular expression of a man recognizing something he'd thought was gone. She thought about Frederick, and the way she thought about him now was different from how she'd thought about him in those first hard months. Still present, still specific, still the handwriting in the margin of every thought she had, but present the way important things were present when they'd stopped hurting and started being simply, solidly part of you. He was in the way she'd written the note for Hennessy. He was in the bread she made on Saturdays. He was in the look she gave to empty pantries and broken down places and frightened people who needed someone to sit in the chair beside them and stay. She didn't need to hold the journal to feel that tonight. She looked at the ceiling. Outside, a clear night was coming in behind the cold, the clouds pulling back, and she knew that by morning the ridge would be visible, hard and white against a hard dark sky, the way it was when the weather was settled and the world had stopped moving and you could see the actual shape of things. Tomorrow she would make breakfast. Caleb would come to the table and drink his coffee and say something dry about the weather. Nathan would come in from the barn with cold air on him and eat standing up until he remembered he'd stopped doing that, and then sit. She would make the notes she needed to make, tend the things that needed tending, be present for what was present. And sometime in April, when the ground softened, she would go out behind the kitchen with a spade. She would dig the old garden up. She would plant something. That was enough to know for now. That was more than enough. The rest would come in its own time, the way things came when you'd stopped trying to force them and started simply doing the next right thing with whatever was in front of you. Not because you were certain it would work, not because you'd been promised anything, but because you had looked at what was there and decided it was enough to build on. She had decided that once, standing in a cold pantry with bones and dried beans and 3 soft onions, and a man in the next room who might still have time. She was still deciding it. Every day, she was still deciding it. And every day so far, it had been true.